He remembered the moment he first wondered if the North would march beneath the flaming heart of his banner. Stannis Baratheon stood on the walls of Dragonstone, the wind whipping at his dark hair, the sky overhead leaden and foreboding. The sea heaved below, spray flying. A single raven perched on a stone gargoyle, silent witness to a troubling dawn. The bird had come at Ned Stark's behest. The letter, so full of careful courtesy, had arrived earlier in the week. It was signed with Stark's name, sealed in gray wax with the direwolf sigil. He had read it 3 times, and each time he felt that subtle flare of possibility. This was no idle invitation or attempt to placate him. Beneath the formal words, he saw that the Lord of Winterfell was offering something honest and real in a world where loyalty had become as thin as a blade of Valyrian steel. He stared at the horizon, trying to imagine what might happen if he accepted this alliance. The tales already reached him of how the boy Robb Stark led a host from the north, swift as a sudden winter storm, but it was the enclosed note from Eddard Stark that weighed on him like a gauntlet. Ned had written that he intended to declare Stannis the rightful heir after Robert's death. Ned's letter was a whisper of promise, acknowledging the falsehood of Cersei's children, the dire need to dethrone Joffrey, and the rightful claim Stannis held to the Iron Throne. Ned said he would champion that claim publicly, but only if Stannis would consider an alliance that recognized the North's autonomy once the war was done. He asked for a union of purpose, justice for Robert, restoration of lawful rule, and the recognition that a rising king in the North and a rightful king in the South need not be enemies. The terms were radical, but more than anything, they hinted at an alliance that would strangle the Lannisters before they could dig their claws in deeper. He was not the man his brother was. Robert would have snorted at alliances on paper, trusting in the might of his warhammer or the charge of his armies to settle matters. But Robert was gone, and the realm was in chaos, threatened by rapacious whelps on the Iron Throne and Tywin Lannister's cunning. Renly, that traitorous pup, already claimed a crown for himself, flaunting every custom of inheritance in the Seven Kingdoms. Stannis could not let that stand. If he was to claim the throne, he needed swords. Storm's End was not enough. House Baratheon had no legions of men to compare with the Lannisters or the Tyrells unless they allied with someone equally determined to see justice done. For the boy who called himself king in the North, the impetus was obvious. House Stark would free itself from southern meddling once and for all. For Stannis, it meant he would stand in King's Landing as the King Robert should have been, true, unyielding, and crowned by rightful law. So he had called Davos seaworth that very evening, instructing him to sail beneath the banner of peace and meet Robb Stark near the neck. The Onion Knight was to confirm the realm's darkest secret, that Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen were born of incest between Queen Cersei and her twin brother Jaime Lannister. Ned's letter had spelled it all out in unwavering detail, but the world needed to be told by a trusted messenger. Davos would also bear a letter from Stannis, hand-signed, stating that he recognized Robb Stark as the king in the North in all but name and that their combined forces would march to topple the Lannisters together. The question was whether the young wolf would trust him enough to accept. Stannis prayed to no gods. His faith was a matter of Lawler now, Melisandre's words ever whispering in his ear, but if there were any justice under the heavens, the North would see that Stannis Baratheon was the truest friend they might find south of the neck. News came swiftly after Davos's departure that Eddard Stark had been taken into custody in King's Landing. Cersei had outmaneuvered him, or perhaps Joffrey had thrown caution to the wind. The details were unclear. The realm believed Ned a traitor. The foolish rumors spinning out of the city told of a man who'd tried to usurp the throne for Stannis. That was true enough in part, but they twisted it further. They said Ned had conspired to kill Robert, that the boy Joffrey had saved the kingdom by preempting Ned's monstrous plan. Lies, each more ridiculous than the last. Then a rumor said Ned Stark might be executed if Robb Stark marched. Another said he was forced to confess his crimes. In the swirl of uncertain tidings, one fact stood out. If House Lannister dared kill Ned Stark, the North would rise in wrath and there would be blood and ruin across the land. Stannis paced his solar, Melisandre's ruby at her throat glowing in the corner of his vision, her eyes reflecting flames he could not see. She whispered of the Lord of Light, of Azor Ahai reborn, of forging the future in righteous fire, but Stannis's mind stayed on mortal concerns. If the Lannisters spilled Ned Stark's blood, all chance of a measured alliance might vanish in the wave of savage vengeance that was sure to follow. Even so, he could not sail unprepared. He had only a small fleet of ships, loyal lords whose hearts burned for him and others who followed because they feared or respected him. He could not act alone to save Ned Stark. That was for the boy in the North. All Stannis could do was trust that events would not unravel before Davos completed his mission. They were still waiting for word from Davos when Maester Cressen's raven arrived one night with frantic tidings. Joffrey had executed Lord Eddard Stark, ignoring Cersei's pleas and spurning the counsel of his small council. The king in the north had been declared. The lords of the north and Riverrun were crying for vengeance, and Tywin Lannister was marshalling a great host to crush them. Renly, too, had declared himself king and was forging alliances with the Tyrells. Stannis had felt a surge of black anger at the news of Renly's arrogance, but also found a glimmer of hope. If the North was ablaze in fury at Ned's death, perhaps they would be eager to accept an alliance from the only man who demanded justice for the realm. With those resolute thoughts, he told Melisandre that soon they would sail for the mainland. She had only smiled in that disconcerting way of hers and murmured that shadows awaited them no matter where they went. At the same time, the young wolf had done the unthinkable. In the space of a fortnight, he had maneuvered his forces southward, outwitting both Tywin and Jaime. Stories filtered down to the Whispering Wood of Jaime Lannister's capture and the subsequent victory at the camps near the Red Fork. Many whispered that Robb Stark commanded not just men, but the very winds of winter, that wolves prowled at night to tear out the throats of unsuspecting outriders. Superstitious nonsense. Stannis had never believed in such things, though he had begun to see real evidence of darker powers since Melisandre came into his life. Even so, the boy's accomplishments were remarkable and terrifying all at once. Only then did a battered ship arrive at Dragonstone, its single occupant staggering onto the quay, exhausted and salt-stained, Davos Seaworth. Davos told him that he had met Robb Stark in the damp halls of Moat Cailin. The boy wore a crown of bronze and iron hammered into the likeness of dire wolf heads, and the lords around him spoke of a new kingdom. Yet when Davos handed over Stannis' letter, the young wolf, quiet and somber beyond his years, listened carefully, his expression never wavering. He had a seriousness that reminded Davos of Ned Stark, though the cunning in the boy's eyes spoke to a flexible mind. Robb had demanded proof of Joffrey's bastardy, and Davos provided the evidence from Ned's own words, sealed with the dire wolf. It was said Ned had uncovered the truth through the lineages in a book that tracked Baratheon traits. All the northern lords, from the Great John to the Blackfish, studied the documents. Finally, after 2 nights of discussion, the young king sent Davos back with a single piece of parchment. On it was Robb's signature, bearing witness that the North would unite with Stannis Baratheon's forces to overthrow the Lannisters on the single condition that the North, after victory, would be acknowledged as an independent kingdom, free of the Iron Throne's rule. The Tullus and the other river lords would remain under the king in the North's protection, but if they wished, they could swear fealty to Stannis. The final lines demanded vengeance for Ned Stark, to see justice done for the murder of his lord father. Davos recalled the haunted look in the boy's eyes as he handed over that document. It was not a request for personal glory or the spoils of war, but a rightful need to see the men who killed Ned Stark brought to their knees. Stannis took that parchment in hand and studied it carefully, ignoring Melisandre's silent presence at his back. He signed his name on it the next morning, affixing the Baratheon seal. The alliance was born of mutual necessity, yet Stannis believed it was the best path forward. Perhaps it was foolishness or desperation, but he sensed that Ned Stark's son might be as honorable as his father. If so, the realm had hope left, however slim. And so war began in earnest. Stannis sailed from Dragonstone under the banner of the crowned stag and flaming heart, shadowed by the Red Priestess. They brought what men they could muster, and the ships that Davos had managed to gather. They crossed the turbulent sea and landed near White Harbor at the invitation of Lord Wyman Manderly, who had declared for Robb. Though travel by ship risked storms and enemy galleys, the route was faster, and the Lord of White Harbor welcomed Stannis with a lavish, if hasty, show of hospitality. The Merman court was all but thrumming with tension at the presence of a southern kingly claimant and the Red Priestess who silently trailed him. Yet they pledged men and ships to the cause, for the king in the north had sent word. Treat Stannis Baratheon as an ally and friend, until the day they were both done with the Lannisters. Already, rumors flew that Tywin Lannister was massing an army near Harrenhal, while a second host loyal to King Joffrey was preparing to meet them near the Trident. Renly's maneuverings in the Reach complicated matters further. The Tyrells had crowned him at Highgarden, hoping to seat him on the Iron Throne as a pliable king. Stannis' teeth ground together whenever he thought of it. Here he was, rightful heir, forging an alliance with the North out of necessity. Meanwhile, the usurper Renly pranced about in bright silks, entertaining the lords with feasts and songs. But that did not matter now. If the North and Dragonstone combined their might, perhaps they could force the Lannisters to yield, or at least sunder their hold on the realm before Renly had the chance to shape everything in his own image. The meeting of the two kings occurred at the ancient fortress known as Moat Cailin, halfway between White Harbor and the heart of the North. It was a rainy, bitter day, the gloom deepened by the weight of expectation. The great causeway leading through the swamp was lined with Stark men bearing the direwolf sigil, and Baratheon soldiers wearing Stannis' colors marched carefully through the muck. With them came knights loyal to houses that had chosen the rightful Baratheon cause. Everywhere men stood watchful, uncertain if old grievances might yet erupt. But the sight of the dire wolf and the flaming heart side by side was something new under the heavens. Robb Stark received Stannis in the shattered Great Hall of Moat Cailin, broken long ago in one of the Northern Wars. The young king wore a simple woolen cloak pinned by a silver wolf's head, a token of his station. Beside him stood the great Jon Umber, tall as a small giant, face set in a perpetual half-grin of anticipation for the next challenge. Roose Bolton's pale eyes flicked over Stannis' men with a disconcerting calm. Lord Bolton was quiet but dangerous. To one side, Catelyn Stark stood with shoulders squared, her grief hidden behind a mask of courtesy. Behind Stannis were his own lords, the Florent men who had abandoned Renly early on, Ser Axel, Lord Valerion, and a handful of bannermen from Storm's End who refused to bow to Renly's claim. Davos Seaworth stood at Stannis' side, looking like a man caught between two storms but resolved to see things through. There was no feasting, no trilling of courtiers, only the pounding rain and the echoes of water dripping through the cracks in the masonry. Robb's face was drawn, his youth clashing with the gravity in his eyes. When Stannis knelt to clasp Robb's wrist, a greeting of equals, a hush spread over the gathered lords. It was an unthinkable gesture, the older man, the rightful king of Westeros by law, acknowledging the young monarch from the north. Yet that single moment told all present that they were bound together in purpose. Robb gently raised Stannis back to his feet, returning the courtesy with a bow of his head. Their pact was sealed by the exchange of words, formal but unwavering in their clarity. Robb would be king in the north and keep the north free forevermore. Stannis would sit on the Iron Throne, displacing the bastard Joffrey and punishing the Lannisters for their crimes. In return, the north would lend its armies to Stannis' march south, and the knowledge that both kings sought justice for Ned Stark and for Robert's legacy lent the pact a sense of moral inevitability. They had no time for long celebrations. News arrived that Tywin Lannister had split his forces, sending half to retake the Riverrun area while the other half marched to defend the road to King's Landing. The war was about to take shape in earnest. Under a gray sky, the two kings and their advisors huddled around damp maps by torchlight, planning how best to strike. The Great Jon wanted to storm Harrenhal itself, but Roose Bolton pointed out that Harrenhal was a fortress of monstrous size. It would swallow an army alive if they tried to besiege it without a cunning plan. The Blackfish argued that they must lift the siege of Riverrun, where Catelyn's brother Edmure was attempting to hold off an onslaught. Stannis listened carefully, interjecting observations about supply lines, the possibility of forging alliances with discontented river lords. He was not a man of honeyed words, but he knew warfare, and when he spoke, men fell silent to hear him. Robb, likewise, listened as a leader should, hearing every perspective. Their synergy was uneasy at first, but it had a strange harmony. Stannis' stern practicality meshed with Robb's calm adaptability. Eventually, they decided on a two-pronged approach. Robb would lead a force west to relieve Riverrun, accompanied by the lords of the north and some of Stannis' men, while Stannis himself would march south with a combined contingent to challenge Tywin Lannister's main host. If Tywin moved to protect the west, Stannis could strike at the Crownlands. If Tywin held his ground at Harrenhal, Robb would have free rein to break the siege. The risk was formidable, but it was the best they could conceive in a realm torn by chaos. Renly's movements in the Reach only complicated the matter further, for rumors said he was courting an alliance with the Dornish, or perhaps forging a match with Margaery Tyrell that might bring Highgarden's strength to bear. Within days, they set their plan into motion. Robb marched west in a thunder of hooves and ring of steel, heading for the Riverlands. Beside him were the Great Jon, Bolton, and many of the younger northern lords. Catelyn Stark rode with them, desperate to see her homeland and her brother freed. With them also rode a smaller contingent of Baratheon knights under Davos's guidance. Stannis, meanwhile, led the bulk of his own men southward, forging a tenuous path through the neck, accompanied by northern outriders who knew the swamps and causeways better than any cartographer's map. In the midst of it all, Melisandre traveled with him, clad in scarlet, her haunting presence unmissable as she rode through the gloom. The heat of war came swiftly. As Robb swept across the riverlands, he smashed a hastily gathered Lannister force at the Red Fork, capturing more outriders than he lost. The rumor of a Baratheon alliance preceded him, leading some smaller lords sworn to the Tullus to rise up. They harried Lannister supply lines, while Robb's dire wolf, Grey Wind, was set to stalk the fields at night, sowing terror among the enemy camp. At Riverrun, Robb's host shattered the siege in a fierce assault, the Greyjohn leading the charge that broke the lines. The battered lion banners fell back, retreating toward the uncertain safety of Harrenhal. The Blackfish reopened the gates of Riverrun, greeting his nephew with grim relief. Edmure, wounded but alive, embraced Robb, tears in his eyes. Some whispered that the Tully fish swam again in free waters, all due to the alliance between the wolf and the stag. Meanwhile, Stannis pushed south, mindful that Tywin Lannister was gathering at Harrenhal. The monstrous fortress loomed on the horizon, its melted towers a monument to hubris. Stannis knew they had no chance of taking Harrenhal by direct assault. They must draw Tywin out. So he feigned movements toward the Crownlands, even dispatching small bands to raid near Rosby and Duskendale, forcing Tywin to react. The weather turned stormy as they moved. Autumn rains lashed the camps, turning roads to mud, but the northern outriders pressed forward regardless, guiding Stannis' men through terrain the Lannisters would find difficult. By the time Tywin realized the bulk of Stannis' force was threatening the road to King's Landing, it was too late to sit idle. He had to march out or risk losing the capital to the rightful heir. So Tywin, cunning as ever, split his host. One part, led by the mountain that rides, would hold Harrenhal. The other, under Tywin's direct command, emerged to confront Stannis near the crossroads. They clashed in a pitched battle that lasted from midday to twilight, the sky stained with the smoke of burning siege equipment and the screams of dying men. Stannis, grim and unyielding, fought like a man possessed, leading charges that surprised Tywin's typically methodical approach. The Northern Horse, commanded by lords loyal to Robb's cause, flanked Tywin's lines, forcing them to realign. But Tywin was too seasoned to let his army break so easily, and his ranks held, a solid wall of steel and gold. The confrontation ended inconclusively, with heavy casualties on both sides. Nightfall brought an uneasy stalemate. Stannis' camp that night was a scene of flickering torches and low groans. The wounded lay under makeshift tents, the maesters working furiously on men spitting blood or howling with shattered limbs. Fires crackled in muddy pits, the smoke mingling with the scent of gore. Stannis himself stood with his lords in a half-ruined tower, staring at a rough map by candlelight. Tywin had not withdrawn, meaning tomorrow would bring another day of bloodletting. Melisandre urged Stannis to trust in the flames, to make a sacrifice to the Lord of Light that they might gain victory. Some of the northern lords, suspicious of her, watched with narrow eyes, but Stannis seemed too weary to engage her riddles. He simply told her that if the Lord of Light willed him to triumph, he would. If not, no flames would change the outcome. At dawn, battle was joined again. This time, Tywin attempted an enveloping maneuver, using the discipline of his knights to try to crush Stannis' flanks. But the Northmen fought with a savage ferocity, refusing to yield. LD. The center of Stannis' line was threatened more than once, but each time Stannis himself rode there, his jaw set in a scowl of determination. Morning stretched to afternoon, the sun high over a battlefield littered with corpses. When word came that the young wolf had arrived at the outskirts of Harrenhal, smashing through the scattered remains of the Lannister forces that had retreated from Riverrun, Tywin realized he was trapped between two armies. Suddenly, the lion was in a cage of its own making. Not wanting to be hammered by Robb's fresh host from the rear while still locked with Stannis in the front, Tywin ordered a withdrawal. He retreated in good order, skillfully covering his escape so Stannis could not chase him down in the chaos. By day's end, Tywin's main host was racing west toward the relative safety of the mountains that shielded the gold roads. The result was a battered but significant victory for the wolf and the stag. They had forced Tywin's retreat, lifted the siege of Riverrun, and established a powerful position in the Riverlands. Common folk began to whisper that the Lannisters were not invincible, that the rightful king and the Northern King had combined their might to quell the lions at last. Some said it was the old gods aiding Robb, others said the Red Priestess had called upon Lawler, but Stannis believed in neither rumor. He believed in the steel of swords and the discipline of men. Yet, for all the victory, they had suffered heavy losses as well, and the war was far from done. In the aftermath, Robb and Stannis met again, this time at the outskirts of Harrenhal, though they made no effort to breach the fortress's walls. The mountain still held it, and Robb wanted vengeance for the atrocities committed by Gregor Clegane in the Riverlands. Yet Stannis cautioned him that while personal retribution was just, they could not squander their combined strength on a pointless siege. The tension between them was palpable. The young wolf, bloody from war, had a growing reputation among his men who believed he could do no wrong in battle. Stannis, older and colder, found that confidence unnerving and reminiscent of Robert in his prime. But he reminded himself that they were allies, not rivals. If they wasted men at Harrenhal, Tywin would have time to fortify the western passes or even slip away to King's Landing. They had to press their advantage. They agreed to leave a small force under Roose Bolton to contain Harrenhal. The rest of their armies would move to secure the Riverlands, forging a path to the capital. Tywin, meanwhile, was scuttling west, possibly to link with Lannister forces near the Golden Tooth or Casterly Rock. That left King's Landing vulnerable, but also left the possibility that Renly Baratheon, with the Tyrells at his back, would attempt to sweep in and take the city first. If that happened, they might find themselves facing Renly's claim to the throne instead of Joffrey's. It was a precarious moment, with the fates of houses and kingdoms hanging in the balance. So the wolf and the stag marched side by side, their massive host crossing the Riverlands. Villages once plundered by Lannister foragers cheered the sight of dire wolf and stag banners fluttering together, hoping these two kings would restore order. Robb, mindful of the horrors that war had already brought, forbade any looting or harassment of the locals. Stannis, though known for his severe discipline, readily agreed. They needed the small folks' cooperation, not their enmity. Knights and men-at-arms distributed what supplies they could spare, a gesture that planted the seeds of loyalty in hearts long grown distrustful of southern armies. Letters reached them from King's Landing, where Joffrey's reign became more erratic by the day. Word spread of the boy king's cruelty, his willingness to lash out at courtiers, and his mother's frantic attempts to control him. The Gold Cloaks patrolled the city's streets with brutal efficiency, searching for any sign of dissent. Some whispered that a peasant rebellion might erupt if the city continued to starve under mismanagement. Tyrion Lannister, newly returned from the Vale, had taken up the mantle of the Hand, trying to instill some semblance of order. But no letter or rumor could hide the fact that the city was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. When they were within a fortnight's march of King's Landing, a raven arrived from Storm's End. It was from Renly, addressing "my beloved brother Stannis" in a flourish of courtesy that made Stannis' jaw clench. Renly proposed a meeting, urging Stannis to set aside old jealousies and join forces with him. In return, Renly would magnanimously allow Stannis to serve as hand or some such nonsense. The letter was full of bright words but little substance, ignoring the fact that Stannis had the law on his side. It also omitted mention of the alliance with Robb Stark. Clearly, Renly hoped that Stannis would be too embattled or desperate to refuse. Stannis snorted and tossed the parchment into the fire. Melisandre watched it burn with a smile on her lips, her eyes dancing as if she saw something in the flames no one else could. If Renly was indeed riding north with the Tyrells, then King's Landing might soon be encircled from both sides. Joffrey had no friends left beyond the walls, but the Lannister name might still sway certain houses if the incentives were right. Spies said that Cersei was desperately seeking an alliance with the Greyjoys of the Iron Islands, or even entreating Pike to raid the northern coasts to draw off Stark's forces. There were rumors that Balon Greyjoy was considering another rebellion, using this chaos to carve out his own kingdom. The realm teetered on a knife's edge. At night, beneath the canopy of stars, the allied armies camped along the King's Road. In one of the larger command tents, Robb Stark and Stannis Baratheon conferred about strategy. Davos stood quietly with them, while Catelyn and the Blackfish listened. The Great John was out in the camp, seeing to the men. Melisandre lingered near the back, silent as a shadow, though her ruby gleamed with every flicker of torchlight. Robb proposed that they launch an immediate assault on King's Landing as soon as they arrived, hoping to catch the city unprepared. But Stannis countered that the city had formidable walls and Tyrion Lannister was rumored to be stockpiling wildfire. A direct assault could result in massive casualties, perhaps the entire city in flames. Instead, Stannis suggested they could blockade the city by land and sea, starving the Lannisters out and providing an opportunity for discontented Gold Cloaks to open the gates. At that, Robb grew uneasy, remembering how the North was unaccustomed to drawn-out sieges. But he recognized the sense of the plan. If the city were turned to rubble in a reckless assault, they would be no better than the Lannisters. Catelyn, seated to one side, asked about negotiations. Could they send an offer to the city, perhaps promising a general pardon for those who surrendered, ensuring that the small folk did not suffer unnecessarily? Stannis, though stern, agreed that a proclamation might sow doubt among Joffrey's supporters. But privately, both kings knew that Joffrey and Cersei would never surrender quietly. There would be blood, one way or the other. As the allies continued south, the weather grew warmer and the dusty roads were thick with refugees. Small folk fleeing war and chaos clogged the pathways, some hauling carts with all their possessions, others with only the rags on their backs. When they saw the northern dire wolf and the stag banners, many begged for help or shelter. Robb ordered that the minimal rations they could spare be shared, and Stannis did not object. The men grumbled about it, but the kings insisted that the realm was their responsibility. In the evenings, men whispered of how Ned Stark would have approved of this mercy, and some began to see Stannis as less aloof than rumor claimed, for he was supporting the same charitable measures. At last, the spires of the city came into view. King's Landing, ringed by high walls, perched on Blackwater Bay. The stench of too many souls crammed into cramped streets reached them even at a distance. The Allied forces made camp well outside the range of the city's scorpions and trebuchets. Word came that the royal fleet, such as it was, loomed in the harbor, but Stannis' navy, though smaller, was commanded by Davos with cunning. Meanwhile, Robb's outriders scouted the surrounding lands, capturing a few stray Lannister patrols. The Gold Cloaks had shut the city gates tight, letting no one out. The siege began in earnest. Immediately, Tyrion Lannister dispatched envoys to parley. Robb refused to meet them, turning them over to Stannis. The Hand of the King, Tyrion's letter said, wished to treat with Lord Stannis to prevent bloodshed. Stannis, never one to shy from a challenge, rode out to a neutral ground near the city, accompanied by a cadre of knights and one very large direwolf. The Great John insisted on bringing Grey Wind, just to unnerve the Lannisters. Tyrion arrived with Bronn and a small group of gold cloaks. They spoke politely enough. Tyrion tried to joke that it was good to see family, even if parted by war, but Stannis did not smile. Tyrion offered terms. Joffrey would name Stannis Lord Paramount of the Stormlands, with freedom to rule as he saw fit. Robb Stark would be named Warden of the North. All that was required was for both kings to bend the knee and recognize Joffrey's rule. Stannis' anger smoldered, but he kept his composure. He stated plainly that Joffrey was no rightful king, and no compromise could be had while that abomination sat the Iron Throne. Tyrion sighed, suggesting that perhaps they could reach a private agreement, but Stannis was unmoved. "I will give you one chance, imp," he said, his voice cold. "Open those gates. Surrender your false king. We will spare the city. If you refuse, no quarter will be given to the Lannisters who remain inside." Tyrion's normally quick tongue struggled for a response. He finally said that even if he wished to, the Queen Regent would never allow it. Stannis nodded once, as if that settled the matter. The meeting ended with no resolution. That evening, the catapults were brought forward, and the city prepared for a siege that might tear it apart from within. Yet events moved swiftly. Before Stannis and Robb could settle into a prolonged investment of the city, a new threat emerged: Renly Baratheon. He approached from the south with a glittering host of Tyrell banners, snaking up the Rose Road. Catelyn Stark rode out at Robb's behest to speak with Renly, hoping to broker a peaceful arrangement. She returned with the news that Renly insisted on his own claim, but was open to a compromise, provided Stannis recognized him as king. That was impossible, of course. Stannis was incensed that Renly dared parade around with the Tyrells, calling himself king when rightful law placed him behind Stannis in succession. With Renly so close, the siege of King's Landing threatened to become a three-way conflict. The wolf and the stag on one side, Joffrey's forces inside the city, and Renly's rose-cloaked armies pressing in from the south. Night fell, and the Allied command tent was abuzz with urgent debate. Some urged an immediate storming of the city before Renly arrived in full strength. Others argued that if they invested themselves in a bloody assault on the walls, Renly might sweep in and claim the city for himself afterward. Robb, though eager to press on, saw the danger of fracturing their alliance at the worst possible moment. Meanwhile, Melisandre whispered her counsel to Stannis, urging him to let her use certain darker arts to remove the threat of Renly. Stannis hesitated, his lips pressed in a thin line. He would not speak of it publicly. On the second night, a thick fog rolled in from the bay. In the hush of pre-dawn hours, men on watch thought they saw shadows move across the far side of the camp, weaving through tents toward Renly's lines. Strange shapes, half-formed, flickered in the moonlight, then vanished. By morning, word spread like wildfire. Renly Baratheon lay dead in his tent, his throat cut by an unknown assassin. Some of his knights claimed it was a shadow with Stannis' face. Others whispered that it was the work of the Red Woman. Panic tore through Renly's camp. The Tyrells recoiled in horror and suspicion, not knowing which side to blame. Many of Renly's men simply defected, uncertain of their loyalties without their charismatic king. Some remained with the Tyrells, refusing to yield. Chaos spread as the once glittering army threatened to fall apart in fear and anger. When the news reached Stannis, he turned ghastly pale, as if an unspoken guilt clung to him. Melisandre stood at his side, her face serene, the ruby at her throat pulsing with a subtle light. He spoke no words to confirm or deny the rumors. The northern lords eyed him warily, and Robb Stark, for the first time, seemed deeply troubled by his ally. He had no proof, but the stories that a shadow bearing Stannis' likeness had murdered Renly spread like a plague. Some said it was a miracle that the Lord of Light had removed the usurper from Stannis' path. Others said it was dark sorcery, far from any true faith. Tensions simmered. The Tyrells were in disarray, but that did not mean they would simply join Stannis. If anything, they might hold a bitter grudge. Loras Tyrell, grief-stricken at the loss of his beloved Renly, vowed vengeance. The queen-to-be, Margaery, vanished into the chaos, sheltered by her family's knights. In that moment of tumult, Tyrion Lannister seized an opportunity. A great green explosion rocked the Blackwater Bay as wildfire caches were set off, targeting the few ships that Stannis had anchored too close to the harbor. The blast tore through the quiet dawn, setting water and wood ablaze in a vivid inferno of emerald flame. Scores of sailors died screaming, and the siege lines near the shore fell back in panic. The city used the respite to dispatch gold cloaks who burned or broke down some of the siege equipment. It was not a decisive victory, but it jarred the allies. With Renly's death fracturing the southern host, King's Landing suddenly had a glimmer of hope. Stannis and Robb pulled back to reassess, uncertain whether the Tyrells would join them or stand aside or even ally with Joffrey in a mad attempt to avenge Renly. The constant swirl of rumor, ambition, and fear threatened to unravel the alliance. Robb, disturbed by the shadowy rumors, confronted Stannis privately, asking what truly happened. Stannis would only say that he did what was necessary to eliminate a false claimant, that the war demanded hard choices. When Robb pressed him, mentioning how Ned Stark would have abhorred dark sorcery, Stannis grew cold, reminding the boy that war was not a place for illusions of purity. They parted on uneasy terms. Even so, they maintained the siege. Tyrion's cunning was not finished, though, and a new wave of wildfire traps were rumored to be hidden near the city's gates. Robb's scouts uncovered suspicious shipments entering the walls at night. One attempt to approach the walls with siege towers ended disastrously when the towers were set ablaze by pots of wildfire launched from catapults. The men who escaped the flames spoke of green fire devouring flesh and melting steel. Morale faltered. The siege lines stretched thin and supply became an issue. Word came from the Western Front that Tywin Lannister had consolidated his forces and was marching east with renewed vigor. If he reached King's Landing before the city fell, the allies would face an enormous army on one side and massive walls on the other. Already, smaller skirmishes erupted with Lannister outriders seeking to cut off supply routes from the riverlands. The war once again hung in delicate balance. Amid this tension, a raven arrived bearing the sigil of House Tyrell. It proposed parley with Stannis and Robb, presumably to discuss their stance after Renly's death. The Tyrells, prideful and furious, demanded an explanation or an apology, but more than that, they wanted to ensure that whoever sat the Iron Throne would favor them. They were not about to let their strength be wasted or overshadowed. And so, near the bitter end of autumn, a delegation from Highgarden arrived under a white flag. Margaery Tyrell, regal and composed despite her mourning clothes, led the group. Ser Loras was notably absent. He refused to set eyes on Stannis, perhaps for fear he would try to kill him on sight. Along with Margaery came Lord Mace Tyrell, trying his best to appear magnanimous. They met in a neutral field, not far from the edge of the Allied camp. Robb Stark stood on one side, wearing his crown of bronze, gray wind at his heel, while Stannis stood grimly on the other, the stag and flaming heart on his doublet. Margaery approached with surprising grace, her expression a mix of sorrow and determination. She spoke softly of Renly's death, calling it a tragedy for the realm. She asked that the Tyrells be assured it was not murder by vile magic. Stannis offered neither an admission nor a denial, simply remarking that Renly challenged the rightful king. Margaery's gaze flickered to Robb, then back to Stannis, measuring them both. In that moment, it was clear she was negotiating from a position of anger but also necessity. The conversation turned to the future of the realm, to the question of whether the Tyrells would fight alongside the alliance or remain aloof. Margaery said House Tyrell would never bow to a king who employed dark sorcery against a member of their family. Yet, the Tyrells also had no love for the Lannisters. The rose had been spurned by the lion more than once, and the city was a nest of vipers. She suggested a path of compromise. If Stannis would not claim responsibility for Renly's death, perhaps they could find a scapegoat, or perhaps the matter could be laid to rest in exchange for certain concessions. Robb listened, increasingly discomfited. He whispered to Stannis that this smelled of blackmail. Stannis, however, told him quietly that alliances with great houses often took on such shapes. Even your father once made peace with houses that had wronged him, he reminded. Still, Stannis would not beg the Tyrells for help. He refused to grovel, so the negotiations ground on. Margaery demanded that the Tyrells retain control of the Reach. That was easy enough, as the North had no interest there, and Stannis only wanted their swords to finish off the Lannisters. She asked that Stannis publicly renounce any involvement in Renly's death, calling it a vile rumor. Stannis struggled with that, but it was a small enough price to keep them from joining the Lannisters. Finally, she required that the alliance compensate House Tyrell with certain privileges once Stannis took the throne. Positions on the small council, favorable trade routes, and a match that would bind House Tyrell to the Iron Throne. As to the last, Margaery's eyes flicked to Robb Stark, as if assessing whether he might be the one to wed her, forging a bond between the North and the Reach. But Robb was already betrothed to a Frey daughter under the terms of crossing the twins. A second possibility was Edmure Tully, but no decision could be made without Edmure's presence. Another was to wed Margaery to Stannis himself, given that his wife, Celis, was known to be in poor health, rumored barren except for the single sickly daughter, Shireen. The conversation lurched into dangerous territory, for Stannis was not about to cast aside his wife for political convenience. Margaery pressed gently, reminding him the king must often do what is necessary. Robb, seeing the tension mounting, stepped in with a suggestion that perhaps Margaery might wed one of Stannis' most trusted lords, someone close enough to hold real power once the throne was taken, but not so close as to overshadow the king. The Tyrells were not thrilled. They wanted the crown in their bloodline. Margaery's face remained poised, but it was clear she had her own designs. The meeting ended without a firm conclusion, though Margaery agreed to a temporary ceasefire with the allied forces. The Tyrell banners would not come to King's Landing's aid, nor would they interfere with the siege so long as no aggression was directed at them. They wanted time to consider further. That concession alone was valuable, for it meant King's Landing would not receive the might of the Reach. And so the siege continued. For weeks, the city slowly strangled, with fewer shipments of food slipping in. Starvation reared its head in the cramped districts. Tyrion struggled to keep order, employing a mix of threats and uneasy alliances with local merchants. Joffrey, bored and petulant, demanded daily attacks on the besiegers, which Tyrion resisted, mindful that each sally would cost the men they could not spare. The tension in the city soared to dangerous heights, with rumors of open revolt in Flea Bottom. Meanwhile, Tywin Lannister's approach from the west became the paramount concern for the allies. If he arrived with fresh forces, they would be pinned. They had to find a decisive stroke before then. One cold dawn, as the allied camp stirred, horns sounded along the western roads. Scouts raced back, crying that Tywin's army was near. Two major battles seemed imminent, the city on one side, Tywin on the other. Robb and Stannis met in council once more, words terse but purposeful. They decided that Robb would lead a portion of the army west to intercept Tywin before he could link with the city. Stannis would tighten the siege, perhaps even attempt a direct assault if an opportunity presented itself, counting on Tyrion's limitations and the city's mounting hunger. The parting was grim. Robb Stark rode west with his dire wolf, Grey Wind, at the head of a column of seasoned northern veterans, Riverland knights, and a contingent of Baratheon soldiers who respected him. Catelyn insisted on remaining near Riverrun to manage defenses there, while Davos stayed with Stannis, helping to coordinate the blockades at sea. Melisandre watched Robb's departure with an enigmatic expression, as if something weighed on her that no one else could see. Within days, Robb clashed with Tywin's vanguard near the Blackwater Rush, driving back the Lannister scouts in a flurry of cavalry charges. But Tywin, canny as ever, feigned a retreat, luring Robb deeper into contested territory. A savage ambush followed, in which the Greyjohn's division was nearly overwhelmed before Robb's timely intervention. Both sides bled, but the Lannisters did not break. Tywin played for time, hoping to pin Robb away from the city long enough for some miracle to occur within the walls. Back at King's Landing, Stannis sensed the shifting winds. Provisions ran short in the Allied camp, too. Desertions began as men grew weary of this stagnant siege. Tyrion's cunning never ceased. Reports indicated he was building new contraptions to hurl wildfire at any attacking force. Storming the gates might be suicide, but continuing the siege risked Tywin's arrival once more. Time was not on their side. Stannis brooded in his command tent, wrestling with frustration. Melisandre urged him to trust in the Lord of Light, to perform a grand sacrifice that would guarantee victory. A captured Lannister knight, perhaps, or even some more innocent blood. Stannis' stomach churned at the thought, but he struggled with the temptation, wanting nothing more than to see the rightful king crowned. The memory of Renly's death lingered like a dark secret on his conscience, leaving him deeply conflicted. One dusk, as a thunderstorm raged overhead, the city gates creaked open. A thin line of weary, starving small folk stumbled out, driven by the gold cloaks. Tyrion had decided to expel the useless mouths, hoping to save what dwindling supplies remained for soldiers. The watchers on Stannis' ramparts gasped at the sight of hundreds of ragged souls trudging through the mud, many collapsing from hunger. It was a cruel tactic. If the besiegers had hearts, they would either feed these unfortunates or watch them die. Stannis, stoic, ordered them to be let through the lines, though there was not enough food to feed them all well. It was a tragedy unfolding in real time. Among those refugees were a few agents, no doubt, but Stannis accepted the risk. Robb's earlier mercies had rubbed off on him more than he cared to admit, or perhaps he recalled a time when Storm's End starved under siege in Robert's rebellion, and how Davos's onions had saved them all. That memory burned, and he could not replicate the cruelty of letting the small folk starve in no man's land. Even so, the strain on the Allied supply grew. If Tywin stayed in the field, the noose would tighten around both sides. The unstoppable war machine threatened to devour them all. Tensions rose in camp. Northern lords, tired of waiting, demanded action. Baratheon bannermen, who once followed Robert, hungered for the glory of open battle. The cautious ones worried that an assault would be a death sentence. In the midst of this turmoil, a messenger arrived from the west with urgent news. Robb had engaged Tywin in a pitched battle near a ford of the Blackwater Rush. The fighting was fierce, neither side giving an inch, but Tywin's forces were too numerous and well-supplied. Robb needed reinforcements if he was to decisively break Tywin's host before it looped around to the city. Stannis knew then that the moment of decision had arrived. They could not simply maintain this standoff indefinitely. Either they would storm the city, risking wildfire and a brutal street-by-street fight, or they would abandon the siege to aid Robb, letting King's Landing stand for the moment. Either choice was rife with peril. As lords argued in the muddy pavilion lit by dripping candles, Melisandre stood apart, her red robes swirling around her, a faint smile curling her lips. She murmured that the fires had shown her a great victory if Stannis marched west to join the wolf, that King's Landing would devour itself from within. Perhaps she believed the city's hunger and Joffrey's cruelty would spark an uprising. Or perhaps she saw some other shadowy path. Stannis, at last, made his decision. He would not sacrifice half his men in a suicidal assault on the walls, not when Tywin might converge on them at any moment. He would join Robb, combine forces, and crush Tywin once and for all. Then, with the Lion defeated, the city would be ripe for the taking. If the city turned on Joffrey in the meantime, so be it. If not, they would return with overwhelming strength. The news was met with relief by many. That very night, horns blew through the camp, summoning men to dismantle siege works and prepare to march. They left a small cordon of watchers around the city to hamper any large sortie. But the main body of the Allied army packed up and started the trek west under stormy skies. Within the city, Tyrion watched from the walls, perplexed. To many, it looked like the alliance was giving up, perhaps acknowledging that the city could not be taken. Joffrey preened, insisting he had driven off the besiegers. Cersei worried that it might be a feint. And indeed, the city remained under threat, for the blockade at sea still existed, courtesy of Davos's ships. But the land armies withdrew, forging a swift path to meet Tywin. For the next several days, the Allied forces marched hard, spurred by urgent ravens from Robb's camp. They followed the winding roads along the Blackwater Rush, the men dogged and weary but resolved. Rain turned the roads to quagmires. Horses struggled, wagons bogged down, and men cursed as the thunder boomed overhead. Melisandre rode at Stannis' side, her scarlet cloak swirling, seemingly untouched by the weather's fury. Lords from the north and the Stormlands alike pressed onward, driven by duty and desperation. At last, they came upon the battlefield. Under a slate-gray sky, the Lannister army was arrayed on a gently rolling plain near a sweeping bend of the river, where a makeshift camp had been fortified with sharpened stakes and ditches. Robb's forces were entrenched just beyond arrow range, battered by prior clashes. Smoke curled from the remnants of scorched siege engines. Bodies littered the fields in the distance, crows already gathering. But with Stannis' arrival came a surge of fresh morale. The wolf and the stag would fight side by side again. They wasted no time. The next day, in a coordinated assault, the Allied forces advanced. Robb led a cavalry wedge that hammered the Lannister flank while Stannis directed the center with merciless discipline. Warhorns blared, men shouted, steel clashed on steel. Tywin's lines bent but did not break at first. The fury on both sides was palpable, a swirling tempest of blood and chaos. Grey wind tore through men, the direwolf's presence fueling the North's savage momentum. Across the field, the stag banners advanced steadily, with Stannis at the forefront cutting down Lannister spearmen who dared stand in his path. For a time, it seemed Tywin might hold. But Robb's cavalry found a weak point in the Lannister flank and drove deep, capturing a key hill. The Greyjoy's thunderous bellows led a charge that shattered the Lannister reserve. When the Baratheon knights poured in from the other side, the Lions began to lose heart. Tywin, seeing the battle slip away, tried to rally his men, but the momentum was gone. Disarray spread, and by afternoon, the Lannister host was in full retreat, streaming west in frantic waves. Robb led pursuit as far as he dared, capturing supply wagons and routing pockets of resistance. By day's end, Tywin had escaped with a fraction of his men, but his army was broken. It was a transformative victory. The field was theirs, though littered with corpses and reeking of death. The wolf and the stag had smashed the greatest Lannister host. Tywin's power was shattered, at least for the moment. When Robb and Stannis met in the aftermath, both men were exhausted, streaked with mud and blood. Yet they clasped forearms, acknowledging the worth of their alliance. Men around them cheered, crying out praises to the king in the north and the rightful king on the Iron Throne. It was a moment of triumph, yet overshadowed by the knowledge that King's Landing still stood. They spent 2 days on the battlefield, tending wounds and burying the dead. Ravens were sent to the lords across the realm, announcing their resounding victory. The captives were questioned, but most of the high-born Lannisters had fled with Tywin. A few lesser knights surrendered. One exhausted messenger arrived from the city, describing riots that had broken out when the Allied armies withdrew. People were starving, cursing Joffrey for not protecting them. Tyrion struggled to quell the chaos, but the city was dangerously volatile. Stannis and Robb knew they had to move quickly, strike while the iron was hot, and take the capital before it could recover. So they marched east once more, buoyed by their victory. Tywin's battered remnants could not oppose them. The minor lords along the route hurried to offer them supplies or neutrality rather than risk destruction. Some gloated that the Lannisters' days were numbered. but a gnawing tension remained beneath the surface. Robb still felt uneasy about Renly's fate and Melisandre's presence, and Stannis wrestled with unspoken guilt. They had forged an alliance that seemed unstoppable, but the cost had been high. Sorrow and doubt weighed on them even as they approached the final confrontation with Joffrey. When they reached King's Landing again, the city was in a state of near revolt. Smoke rose from burned-out districts. The gates were shut, gold cloaks patrolling the walls with a nervous energy. The battered royal fleet remained anchored in the bay, dwarfed by the blockade that Davos maintained. Tyrion's cunning defenses, wildfire caches, and scorpion emplacements were still a threat, but the defenders' morale was shaky at best. Many had lost faith in Joffrey's reign. As the allied columns arrayed around the city for a final siege, a swift exchange of ravens was initiated. Stannis demanded the city open its gates and surrender Joffrey, promising leniency for the smallfolk. Robb pledged that no harm would come to those who had not directly participated in Ned Stark's murder. It was a generous offer, all things considered. But Cersei, determined to protect her son, refused. Tyrion, apparently hemmed in by the Queen Regent, could do little. The city braced for an assault. Before the dreaded dawn of battle, a hush fell over both camps. Men sharpened swords, whispered prayers, or drank themselves into uneasy sleep. The next morning, the horns echoed across the fields as the allied armies advanced. Ladders and siege towers rolled forward even as barrels of wildfire were hurled down from the walls. Green flames erupted in patches, men screaming as they were consumed. Yet wave after wave of attackers pushed on, bolstered by archers and crossbowmen returning fire. On the west side, Robb led the Northmen, forging a path with their own ladders and battering rams. On the north side, Stannis directed his knights, seeking a breach. The gold cloaks fought, but many tossed down their arms or switched sides when seeing the might arrayed against them. The faint echoes of chaos within the city told of rebellious smallfolk opening city gates or fighting the crown's men. At last, a portion of the walls collapsed under the pounding of a massive siege ram, and hundreds of allied soldiers surged in. The city's defenses buckled. Joffrey, it was said, turned pale and fled to the Red Keep, screaming at his mother to save him. The gold cloaks melted away in droves. Tyrion, valiantly trying to maintain order, was wounded by a stray arrow. The streets devolved into pockets of violence. Robb's men tried to keep discipline, but some chaos was inevitable. Still, the presence of so many banners, dire wolf and stag, kept a sense of higher purpose. By midday, the city gates were thrown wide from within. The wolf and the stag entered King's Landing, triumphant. At the Red Keep, a final stand by the Kingsguard ended swiftly. Ser Meryn Trant was cut down by northern swords. Ser Boros Blunt surrendered, whimpering for mercy. In the throne room, Joffrey cowered on the Iron Throne itself, clutching the Baratheon Lannister crown. Cersei stood beside him, raging at Stannis and Robb in turn. Stannis strode forward, every inch the rightful king, ignoring Cersei's shrill tirade. Robb hung back, a swirl of feelings in his chest as he thought of his father's death and the blood spilt. At Stannis' signal, the gold cloaks tore Joffrey from the throne. The boy screamed curses at them, calling for their heads. Cersei tried to hurl herself at Stannis, but was seized by guards. In the hush that followed, Stannis surveyed the throne he had claimed by law and war. He turned, meeting Robb's gaze. For an instant, they shared the recognition of what they had accomplished together. Then Stannis, setting his jaw, ascended the dais. It was a moment that would resound throughout the Seven Kingdoms. The wolf and the stag, allied from the start, had broken the Lannister grip on power, dethroned a bastard king, and avenged Ned Stark's murder. The cost had been enormous, in blood and sorrow and the unspoken shadows that still haunted them. Yet the realm had a chance, however slender, at a new beginning. All around, men cheered or knelt, some weeping with relief, others chanting the names of their kings. Robb looked across the throne room, seeing the great iron seat that had once been occupied by Mad Aerys, then by his friend Jon Arryn's ward, Robert, and now by Robert's brother. He let out a slow breath, thinking of his father and the legacy of House Stark. The North was free, and the man who wore the crown in King's Landing had heeded their alliance. The future stretched out before them, uncertain but filled with possibilities. He clutched the hilt of his sword, gray wind at his side, and turned away from the iron seat. He would have no part of that monstrous chair of swords. His place was the North. Stannis, seated on the throne, the clang of steel echoing around him, declared in a voice that carried through the hall that justice would be done. Joffrey and those responsible for Ned Stark's death would face trial. The Lannister name would answer for its crimes. He spoke of forging a new order, free of the incestuous secrets and tyranny that had corrupted the realm. For the first time, Stannis sounded almost regal, his natural sternness tempered by the scale of victory and perhaps a new understanding that he could not stand alone. The Wolf King in the north had proven that. The hour was late by the time the Allied flags flew over the Red Keep. The battered city smoldered, but a new day beckoned. On the horizon, storms cleared, leaving the sun's rays to glint off the black waters of the bay. Outside the walls, the dead lay thick, a reminder of the price paid for this moment. Inside, a boy who called himself king nursed his bruises and howled in fear. Elsewhere, a mother wept in fury, cursing those who had undone her golden house. Servants ran through the corridors, breathless with rumors that the rightful king now sat the throne. Yet above all the chaos, two sigils still soared. The dire wolf of House Stark and the crowned stag of House Baratheon wreathed in flame. Allies by necessity, forging a fragile hope for a realm that had been plunged into war and darkness. Outside the throne room, Robb Stark found a moment of quiet by a window overlooking the yard. He stood there, battered sword in hand, gazing at the smoking rooftops, listening to distant cries in the streets. He thought of Winterfell's snows and the faces of his brothers and sisters, scattered by the same war that had brought him here. He thought of his mother, somewhere in Riverrun, praying for their family's safety. He thought of the old gods, how distant they felt in this southern capital with its red temples and rotting hypocrisy. Then he felt a hand on his shoulder, looked up to see Stannis standing beside him. The older man said nothing at first, simply stared out over the battered city. "We've won a great victory," Stannis finally said, his voice rough. "But you and I both know the cost. And we both know this isn't an end. The realm has been scarred, and those scars may never fully heal." Robb nodded, words failing him for a moment. Then he said, "What now, your grace?" letting a wry half-smile touch his face, acknowledging that Stannis was indeed the king in the south. Stannis was silent for a long time, the lines of his face etched by the weight of the crown that now rested upon his head. "Now," he said, "we set about making it right, or as right as we can manage. You will go home, king in the north, to tend your own realm. I will root out the last of the Lannisters, see that justice is done, and restore law and order. And if the gods are just, be they old gods or new or the Lord of Light, they will let us find some peace." Robb stared at him, measuring those words. "We'll see about peace," he murmured, voice low. He thought of White Walkers in the far north, rumors of undead things glimpsed by the Night's Watch. He thought of the storm of ravens that had once come from the Wall too, warn of a threat older than the Seven Kingdoms. But that, too, was a concern for another day, another story. For now, they had wrested the realm from the lion's jaws. He inclined his head to Stannis, then turned to walk away. Winterfell beckoned. The North needed him. Let the new king in King's Landing forge his own realm. Robb Stark had fought for vengeance and independence, and he had achieved it. His father's spirit might rest easier now. So ended the day that saw the wolf and the stag triumphant. The city's bells tolled, half for mourning, half for deliverance. The war had not ended, for scars always linger, and new threats might yet emerge. But for that moment, the battered realm glimpsed a faint promise that two kings, so different and yet united by purpose, might guide Westeros away from the chaos that had consumed it. Shadows still lurked in dark corners, and the future's path was never guaranteed. Still, the dire wolf and the flaming stag had rewritten history, forging an alliance no bard would have dared imagine. And from the twisted iron seat, the rightful king Stannis Baratheon would strive to rule with a justice as stern as the North's winter and as unyielding as the storms of the narrow sea. The realm would never be the same again. He stood by the cracked window of Maegor's holdfast, struggling to collect his thoughts. The light of early dawn glinted on the black waters beyond the city walls, and the air smelled of cinders. King Stannis Baratheon had seized his birthright in a swirl of iron and blood, yet the victory felt as heavy as lead in his chest. He rubbed a hand across his rough jaw, still in the garb he'd worn on the field the previous day. Dried sweat and grime caked in the seams of his boiled leather. A dull ache crept across his shoulders. He had not slept more than a snatch or two in the past 2 nights. War rarely allowed a man even the mercy of dreamless slumber. In the throne room beyond these private corridors, the Iron Throne stood newly occupied, the realm's greatest seat of power, no longer the plaything of a bastard king. Joffrey Baratheon, or rather Joffrey Lannister, was under guard. Cersei, too, had been confined, her shrieks echoing as she was pulled away from her son. The Red Keep still bristled with tension, for gold cloaks had scurried to bend the knee only after being certain Stannis would take the city. Tyrion Lannister, who had tried to keep order in the capital, lay recovering in the maester's care. He had been struck by an arrow in the last hours of the chaotic fighting. Reports varied as to whether the wound was life-threatening. Outside, King's Landing smoldered. In Flea Bottom, rebel mobs had overthrown what remained of the Royal Watch, enraged by years of cruelty and starvation. Even as Stannis' combined armies had forced the gates, the starving throngs had rushed to claim vengeance on their tormentors. Now the city was an uneasy mix of celebration and dread. Commoners had prayed for deliverance from Joffrey's madness, but the presence of 2 occupying forces, one from the north and one from Dragonstone, created fears of martial law. And behind every door and along every alley, the stench of rotting refuse and the sour reek of old blood served as a bleak reminder that war had come once again to the capital. Stannis inhaled a slow breath and turned from the window. His crown, Robert's crown, once glinted on a small table newly retrieved from the treasury. He would have to don it soon and face the realm as its rightful king, a burden he'd sought but not welcomed. Part of him still burned with anger that it had even come to this. If only Robert had named him hand after the rebellion, if only Ned Stark's warnings had been heeded earlier, if only Cersei's incest had been exposed in time. The if-onlys could haunt a man to madness. And so he set them aside. The realm was his responsibility now. Like an iron gauntlet, that realization squeezed his heart. A sharp rap on the door tore him from his thoughts. "Your Grace," came a voice, Davos Seaworth, quiet but resolute. "They are assembled in the throne room." Stannis glanced at the table, at the black metal crown. "Let them wait," he muttered, but in truth he would not delay long. He had tasks enough without indulging himself in second thoughts. He fastened the crown around his temple. The weight felt odd and uncomfortable against his stiff, salt and pepper hair. He opened the door and Davos inclined his head, motioning for Stannis to follow. The passageway smelled of damp stone and old smoke. Guards flanked them, wearing the crowned stag and fiery heart on their tabards. They made their way through the keep, passing halls still dotted with small pockets of confusion. Some gold cloaks had yet to accept the new order. Others performed the half-hearted duties of men who suspected they might not last the day. Here and there, battered red and gold Lannister banners lay in corners like discarded rags. In other corners, Stannis' men had strung up fresh Baratheon standards or even improvised ones combining the stag's silhouette with a flaming heart. Outside the doors to the throne room, 2 tall knights stood watch. One was a Baratheon bannerman, Ser Roland Storm, an illegitimate cousin of Stannis' from the Stormlands, and the other was a Northman sworn to King Robb Stark. Symbolic, that. A reminder that none of this would have been possible without their unprecedented alliance. Stannis nodded sharply at them. They pushed the doors open, letting him stride into the hall. Inside, torches guttered along the columns, filling the cavernous space with wavering shadows. High lords, knights, and representatives of the North stood or knelt on the glossy marble. In the swirl of color, 2 sigils dominated the scene, the direwolf of Stark, gray on white, and Stannis' crowned stag wreathed in flames. At the far side, upon the dais, rose the Iron Throne itself, an ugly mass of fused swords that could maim an incautious king. Stannis had sat upon it for mere minutes the previous day, his claim sealed when Joffrey was dragged screaming from its seat. But these formalities demanded a proper entrance. He walked down the center aisle, his back straight, ignoring the stares of men who had never been certain they would see him crowned. Some looked at him with hope, others with distrust, and a few with fear, particularly those who had worn the Lannister lion on their breasts until yesterday. On the left side of the dais stood Robb Stark, king in the north. The youth wore a more modest circlet of bronze and iron hammered with dire wolf heads, as well as a simple cloak pinned by a wolf's head brooch. His thick auburn hair hung disheveled from days of warfare. Grey wind sat at his side, hackles lowered but not altogether at ease. To Robb's right stood a cluster of Northmen, Great John Umber, tall and brash, Roose Bolton, pale-eyed and cool, Lady Catelyn Stark, who had arrived after the city's fall to find her son victorious and her family avenged. She wore her mourning clothes, the color draining what little cheer might have come from victory. Further among them stood Brynden Blackfish Tully, face lined by sorrow and relief in equal measure, and some knights who had joined from the riverlands. On the right side of the dais were lords sworn to Stannis, lords from Dragonstone and the Stormlands who had never recognized Renly's claim, along with a few who had converted after Renly's death. Some wore the old Baratheon crown stag, others the flaming heart, for the Red Priestess's influence still ran strong among certain ranks. Among them stood Melisandre of Ass High, her red robes shimmering, ruby at her throat pulsing like a heartbeat with every flicker of torchlight. Her presence made more than a few men uneasy. She said nothing, simply watched as Stannis approached. Stannis ascended the steps to the throne with the purposeful stride of a commander. He turned to face the hall, letting his gaze sweep over the crowd. Silence dominated, broken only by the faint crackle of the torches. He knew what they expected, an address, a proclamation, some statement of how he would lead the realm. Public speaking was not his strength, but a king had duties beyond the battlefield. He drew a breath. "Hear me," he began, voice raw in the hush. "We stand on the far side of a war that has cost us dearly. Our foes have been cast down, our rightful claims established. Joffrey, an abomination conceived by incest, sits in chains. The Lannisters who shielded his false reign are scattered. Renly Baratheon, who sought to seize the throne in defiance of our laws, is dead." He paused, letting those words settle, conscious of how many still whispered that a shadow had ended Renly's life. "I hold this throne now by law," he continued, "and by the might of those who chose justice over perfidy. I claim no glory in it. My brother Robert took it with the help of Eddard Stark. Now, once again, a Stark has aided a Baratheon, and justice is done for Robert and for Eddard alike." He inclined his head toward Robb. The young king returned the gesture as lords in the hall murmured or shifted. "My first edict," Stannis said, "is simple. No man or woman who yields peacefully will suffer retribution. We shall have a trial for the principal architects of this realm's woes. That includes Joffrey, Cersei, and those who orchestrated Lord Eddard Stark's execution. The small folk of King's Landing will not be harmed by the new king's hand. Their sufferings have been too many. Anyone found looting or raping in this city will face the king's justice. Is that understood?" A wave of assenting murmurs rose around the hall. Some men looked relieved, others looked as though they had lost unexpected spoils of war. But no one voiced opposition. Not in front of two kings and all these armed retinues. He let the hush linger, then added, "King Robb Stark, our ally, has won independence for the north by right of conquest and by my agreement as lawful king of the realm south of the Neck. His father's death will be avenged, in part, by the extermination of those who condoned it. That is my promise." Robb gave a slight bow, the tension in his face betraying the complicated mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. Ned Stark's death could never truly be undone, but this alliance had brought vengeance closer, and the North its freedom. Great John Umber grinned fiercely. Lord Bolton stood as impassive as a wax statue. Catelyn Stark closed her eyes, her lips moving soundlessly, perhaps in prayer. Stannis surveyed them all. "This is but the beginning. Our realm is wounded. The scars of war do not vanish overnight. We must restore order." He gestured for Davos Seaworth to step forward. "Ser Davos, my hand shall coordinate with King Robb and his lords to see that food and relief are provided to the city. The winter harvest will soon be upon us, and we will do what we can to prevent the starvation that has plagued King's Landing." Some in the crowd exchanged startled glances. Davos had never been a highborn lord. He was an onion smuggler elevated to knighthood by Stannis' own hand. Yet none dared gainsay this choice publicly. Davos knelt, an awkward gesture, given he had only half the fingers on one hand, and then rose, the chain of the hand of the king glinting at his neck. Robb's lords looked on with polite neutrality. If their alliance with Stannis had taught them anything, it was that this king did not dispense favors by birth. When no one spoke, Stannis gave a brusque nod and said, "That is enough for now. Return to your duties. There is more to do than stand about gawping. Let it not be said that King Stannis suffers idle hands." He turned, stepping toward the throne as if to seat himself, but paused. He had expected cheers or applause, but the mood in the hall was hushed, heavy as storm clouds. War might be over for King's Landing, but the realm was far from at peace. One by one, the onlookers filed out, lords giving stiff bows, knights stooping, guards adjusting their grips on their spears. On the dais, Robb Stark lingered, as did Catelyn, Roose Bolton, and several of the more prominent Northmen. Melisandre remained in the shadows, face composed. Davos hovered near Stannis, all too aware that the alliance was fragile. It was then that Catelyn, voice soft but steady, said, "Your Grace, if I might have a moment?" Stannis beckoned her to speak. The Lady of Winterfell was older than Robb, her auburn hair streaked with white. Grief had hollowed her cheeks, but her eyes stayed bright with a mother's resilience. She swallowed, folding her hands in front of her. "My son and I have agreed that the men of the North will not tarry in the South overlong. The North needs its king back. Yet certain matters remain. I ask your Grace to confirm the royal pardons for Sansa Stark and to aid us in finding Arya Stark." Both were in King's Landing when Ned was— She could not finish the sentence, a quiver in her voice. Robb, standing beside her, nodded. "I lost track of my sisters when father was arrested. My mother has scoured the city for rumors. Some say Sansa was forced to remain in the Red Keep as Joffrey's hostage. Arya vanished, no one knows how. I would see them safe before we depart." Stannis considered. "Yes," he said at length. "Sansa Stark is discovered, I believe, in the keep itself. My men say she is alive. The Lannisters had her locked away. She will be released to you at once, if that is your wish." He did not voice that he had heard Sansa was in a state of deep shock after the horrors she'd witnessed. There would be time for that conversation later. "As for the younger girl, if she remains in the city, we will do everything possible to find her." Catelyn's relief was plain on her face. She bowed her head. "Thank you, Your Grace. She may not be here. One rumor suggested she escaped the day of my husband's execution with the help of a friend. I beg you to keep watch for any sign of her, in the city or beyond. She is but a child." "I give you my word," Stannis said curtly. "Davos, see that we spread the word to the Gold Cloaks. Any sign of Arya Stark is to be reported and the child brought to safety." Davos placed his hand over his heart in assent. In the shadows, Melisandre's ruby gleamed, but she said nothing. Robb exhaled, tension draining from his posture. The Great John cleared his throat, grinning. "A good day for House Stark that your sisters found. I'll drink to that." He clapped Robb on the shoulder. Stannis, however, was less celebratory. The city was still precarious. People starved. Tywin Lannister had escaped west, battered but still dangerous. Cersei and Joffrey faced trial. The realm's finances were in disarray, the royal treasury near empty. War might have dethroned the false king, but the time of challenges was far from over. He lifted a hand, gesturing for Davos to follow. "Attend me," he said, glancing once at Robb, who gave a nod of acknowledgement as if to say they would speak again later. That same morning, King Robb Stark paced a small courtyard in the Red Keep near a patch of withered rose bushes that had once been Cersei's pride. The rains had come in the night, leaving muddy puddles that glistened under a feeble sun. Gray wind loped around the edges, sniffing curiously at scorched stones. Robb wore plain riding leathers unmarked by any crown. His bronze and iron circlet sat in his quarters, set aside for the moment. He felt a twinge of guilt standing here, remembering that both Ned and Sansa had once described the Red Keep's gardens as beautiful. Now it looked half destroyed, a reflection of the capital's sorry state. His mother joined him, stepping gingerly around the wet patches. She had shed her black mourning cloak in favor of a simpler garment, though her sorrow remained in the lines of her face. "They've brought Sansa to our chambers," Catelyn said softly. "She's frightened, but I managed to speak with her a short while. She didn't understand what was happening at first, only that Joffrey was dethroned." Robb felt a pang. His sister was little older than he, yet had been made to endure captivity and the constant threat of Joffrey's cruelty. "I'll see her soon," he promised. "And then, as soon as we can, we're taking her home. The North is free. She'll have peace there." Catelyn nodded, but her eyes flickered with concern. "Will we truly have peace, Robb? Even with the alliance, even with Stannis on the throne? We have the Ironborn to consider. They've already begun raiding the Stony Shore. I had a raven from Bran. He writes that Balon Greyjoy has declared the Iron Islands independent. They've taken Deepwood Motte, or so rumor says. And your sister Arya is still missing. We can't be certain she's in the city at all." He pressed his lips into a thin line. "One thing at a time, Mother. The Ironborn must be dealt with. But we cannot ignore the possibility of a new war, and I'd prefer to avoid fighting on two fronts. If we can get the truth from Balon Greyjoy, whether it's a bluff or a true uprising, perhaps we can remind him that the North is not easy prey. Or we can bring Stannis to intervene. His navy might keep the Ironborn busy, blockading Pike if it comes to that." Catelyn's mouth tightened. She had never trusted the Ironborn, nor did she believe they were easily cowed. "You'll have to negotiate carefully. Balon kneels to no one willingly." Robb nodded. Part of him yearned to ride north immediately to secure his home, see Bran and Rickon again, ensure Winterfell was safe. But he was king in the north now, and that title bore responsibilities greater than a single holdfast. He had to think of the entire region, from the White Knife to the Barrowlands, from the Neck to the Wall. And then there was the matter of courtesy. With the capital in flux, it would be poor form simply to slip away without finalizing their alliance's terms. I'll speak with Stannis again, see if we can coordinate a response. Then we'll make for Winterfell as soon as possible. He and his mother walked in silence for a time, passing the charred rose bushes, each lost in thought. At length, Catelyn said, "We've come so far, but my heart tells me we've a distance yet to go." She thought of the White Walkers rumored in the far north, though most still scoffed at such legends. She thought of the Targaryen girl rumored to be across the sea, raising dragons. The world seemed full of threats, looming and half-known. "All we can do is hold to our honor. That was your father's way." Robb nodded, the memory of Ned heavy in his chest. "We will, mother. That I promise." Within the Red Keep's damp cells, Joffrey Baratheon paced, raging. His blonde hair, once curled and pampered, hung limp. Dark circles rimmed his eyes from sleepless nights. 3 Baratheon knights, men now sworn to Stannis, stood guard outside the cell. It had once been used for noble prisoners, so at least he had a bed and a pitcher of stale water. Cersei was kept a few cells away, albeit in more comfort, though she spent her days hurling threats at the guards. Joffrey had demanded an audience with his uncle, screeching that he was the rightful heir, but no one paid him heed. Rumors said a trial was being prepared. Trial for what? He wanted to scream. For being king? For giving a traitor's daughter what she deserved? He thought bitterly of Sansa Stark, whose father he had executed. He still felt it was her fault for not being obedient enough. In his more lucid moments, he realized how dire his position was. With Tywin fled, Uncle Jaime still captive in the Riverlands, and the city turned against him, he had no allies left. His Kingsguard had melted away. The gold cloaks had cast him off. Even his grandfather's money had not saved him. He wanted to kill them all. He wanted to stand in the throne room, crossbow in hand, and let the bolts fly. But he was caged, powerless for the first time in his life. Outside, the guards murmured. One said something about the king in the north. The mere phrase made Joffrey want to spit. That boy was younger than he was, yet he had managed to unseat him with the help of Stannis' treasonous armies. The idea that his so-called uncle, a humorless stick of a man, now wore the crown was beyond infuriating. Joffrey told himself that soon Tywin Lannister would come roaring back, that the city would rise up in fury at being stolen from him. But in his gut he knew no one was coming. The game was over. He collapsed onto the straw mattress, fists clenched, hatred coursing through him. Perhaps they'd come to release him. They had to, eventually. After all, he was the king. Wasn't he? Cersei Lannister's quarters were slightly more comfortable than her son's cell, though not by much. They had given her a small suite within Maegor's holdfast, under guard at all times, with the windows barred. She sat by the open shutters, gazing at a sliver of the city she had once ruled through her manipulations. Her hair was tangled, her eyes red from weeping. Rage still fueled her, but it was an impotent, seething kind of rage, caged as she was. Once she had seen herself as a lioness, unstoppable. She had orchestrated King Robert's downfall through 1,000 small intrigues and had planned to rule through her son. Now that future was ash. Joffrey was a prisoner, Myrcella was far away in Dorne, and Tommen, she had no idea if Stannis' men had found him yet. Probably locked up as well. She cursed the world that had refused to give her a chance at real power, that forced her into a marriage with a boorish drunk and now left her at the mercy of the humorless brother-in-law she had scorned her entire life. More than once, she had screamed at the guards that she demanded an audience with Tyrion or Varys or anyone who still had ears within these walls. But none came. The only visitor had been a solemn Maester Pylus who offered her medicines for her nerves which she had flung in his face. She felt trapped in a nightmare that refused to end. A rustling at the door startled her. A guard stepped in, flanked by 2 others. "My lady," he said woodenly, "prepare yourself. You will be called to speak before King Stannis soon." She rose with a sneer. "I am Queen Regent of the 7 Kingdoms. You have no right to keep me here." They did not argue, only repeated the instruction. She tried to fling a goblet at them, but it clanged harmlessly off an armored chest. With that, they withdrew, leaving her panting in frustration. At last, she slumped onto a chair, tears threatening to break through once more. "Jaime," she whispered. "If only he were here, free and with an army behind him, all would be different. But if wishes were horses, beggars would ride, as the saying went." Desolation gnawed at her. She could only await the trial, though she swore if they condemned her, she would find a way to drag them down with her. In a different wing of the keep, the sweetling voice of a singer drifted into the corridors, attempting to soothe the battered hearts of the city's new rulers. But in the solar itself, the tension was thick as mortar. 2 chairs faced each other, with a low table between them. On one chair sat Margaery Tyrell, clad in a muted gray gown with subtle green embroidery, mourning colors for her lost husband, Renly Baratheon. Her face was composed, her posture impeccable, but grief and fury simmered beneath. Across from her sat King Stannis Baratheon, posture rigid. Davos stood off to one side, arms folded across his chest, the hands chain on display. A moment of silence stretched. At last, Margaery said, "We have come to the capital in answer to your invitation. My father, Lord Mace Tyrell, will arrive soon. My brother Loras. He could not bring himself to speak with you, your grace. He still believes that you—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "That you bear guilt for Renly's death. I understand you deny such charges." Stannis's mouth tightened. "Renly died because he made himself a false king. War claimed him. That is all. I have nothing further to say on the matter." It was a rehearsed line by now, one that distanced him from the shadowy truth. Melisandre's presence in the corner was not lost on Margaery, though she never let her gaze linger on the Red Priestess. Margaery inclined her head just slightly. "Of course. Still, we have cause to distrust those who consort with dark powers. Be that as it may, House Tyrell is not here to rake through old wounds. We come because this realm's stability is paramount. The fields and orchards of the Reach cannot supply a realm torn by constant war. We must have a stable king in King's Landing. My father wishes to know what place House Tyrell shall have in this new order." Davos cleared his throat softly. "His Grace acknowledges the importance of Highgarden. Indeed, to feed the city we need your harvests. The war has ravaged the Crownlands. We would be in your debt, to put it plainly." Stannis watched Margaery's face, aware that every courtesy would be tested. The Tyrells were proud, and they had nearly thrown their lot in with Joffrey or even the Lannisters after Renly's demise. But the Lannisters' fortunes had tumbled. The Tyrells had no reason to cling to them now. Still, they would not surrender their advantage without extracting a heavy price. Margaery let silence spin for a moment. "You say you are in our debt. Indeed, Highgarden's grain can feed the city. Our silver can prop up a treasury left bare by the Lannisters. But we require more than gratitude." She turned her gaze on Stannis. "We require security. We require influence. House Tyrell will not be overshadowed or slighted." Stannis's throat clenched. He hated politics, but he had no illusions. To rule effectively, he needed the Tyrells. "Name your terms," he said. "Let us see what can be granted." She set her hands neatly in her lap. "My father will detail them at length, no doubt, but consider these preliminaries: a seat on your small council for the Tyrell representative, likely my father or another of his choosing. Lands that were seized from our lesser bannermen by House Lannister must be restored. And perhaps a marriage alliance to tie House Tyrell to the throne, ensuring our bond is more than mere words." Stannis' scowl deepened. She was dancing around the possibility of wedding him. That was no secret. But he had a wife, Celis, though she was rarely at court, living in near seclusion at Dragonstone. Margaery's last attempt at being queen had ended with her husband's shocking death. Did she truly seek to claim the title again? Or was she simply testing how far Stannis would bend? "I have a wife," he stated firmly. "Queen Celis. No matter what you may have heard, I have no intention of discarding her. She has borne me an heir. Shireen might be a sickly girl, but she was all he had. As for any other alliances, we can discuss suitable matches for lords in my circle or some other arrangement that might please your father." Margaery's expression did not flicker. "Of course. Forgive me if I overstep. It is only natural that, after Renly, my family would prefer I wed someone of stature. But if that is not to be," she trailed off, allowing the implication to remain. Perhaps she would accept a lesser match if it gave her enough power to shape events at court. The conversation turned to more pragmatic points: ships for trade, wagons of grain, details of ravaged farmland in the Reach, debts owed by the crown. Melisandre did not speak. She watched Marjorie with calm intensity, like a cat eyeing a bird just out of reach. Stannis, for his part, had little patience for the bargaining. Yet he forced himself to endure it, knowing the city could not withstand famine. The Tyrell barges were already moored along the Blackwater, awaiting safe passage. By the end, Marjorie rose to leave, satisfied enough to continue negotiations another day. Davos offered to escort her out. She dipped her head politely and departed, the train of her gown sweeping over the flagstones. Only when she was gone did Stannis let out a soft grunt of irritation. "I dislike this dance," he muttered. "The dance is necessary, Your Grace," Davos said gently. "Without it, we risk losing the Tyrells. And the city cannot afford that." Stannis nodded grimly. "Aye. See that the terms are made as fair as possible. Let us not give them a reason to hold grudges. We have enough foes." He noticed Melisandre in the corner. "What say you?" She tilted her head, coppery hair shifting over her shoulders. "She has the glimmer of ambition. But if she helps our cause, that too may be the Lord of Light's design." Stannis's mouth twisted. He had grown to respect Melisandre's counsel in many ways, but the circumstances of Renly's death still sat in his conscience like a stone. Perhaps that was why she had said little just now. "There will be no more talk of shadows," he said quietly. "We will win through mortal means." Her ruby flickered. "As you command, Your Grace." She bowed her head, but in the flicker of her eyes, Stannis wondered if she glimpsed some future that he could not. Over the next weeks, King's Landing struggled toward a semblance of normalcy. Robb Stark, anxious to return home, assisted Stannis in restoring order. Joint patrols of northern men and Baratheon knights worked to quell pockets of rioting, ensuring that the Gold Cloaks complied with the new regime. Supplies arrived from the Reach, albeit slowly. Grain and fish began to fill the markets, calming some of the city's hunger. Prices remained high and tension lingered, but the worst of the immediate crisis abated. Within the Red Keep, Stannis established a provisional small council. Davos Seaworth served as hand. Melisandre was not officially on the council, but her influence was felt. A rotating set of lords from the Stormlands and the Crownlands filled out the seats. Tyrion Lannister, ironically, found himself recuperating in a small tower cell, neither free nor entirely a prisoner. Stannis recognized his mind might prove useful, but the city's mood demanded that any Lannister remain under guard. Tyrion, bandaged and stiff, offered counsel on how to restore the city's finances. Whether Stannis would accept it remained an open question. Trials loomed. Cersei and Joffrey, as well as a handful of lesser Lannister loyalists, awaited judgment. The entire realm watched eagerly, for if a king could be tried, then truly the old order had broken. The city's rumor mill spoke of new outrages daily. Some said the Tyrells would manipulate the trials to gain favor. Others insisted that Stannis might simply execute them all. Still others muttered that Robb Stark would insist on personally beheading Joffrey in vengeance for Ned Stark. The tension built with every passing day. Robb Stark, in the midst of all this, faced new revelations about the state of the North. Ravens arrived with dire tidings. Balon Greyjoy had indeed declared himself king of the Isles. Asha Greyjoy had seized Deepwood Motte, while Victarion Greyjoy harried ships along the coast. The old rumor of Theon Greyjoy's presence at Winterfell reared its head, though no one knew if it was true. Worse still, another letter arrived from the Wall, bearing the mark of the Lord Commander. It spoke of wights and wildlings, of undead things glimpsed in the northern forests. Catelyn read it with growing alarm. Robb's first impulse was to rush north to quell the Ironborn and address the threat from beyond the Wall. Yet he still lingered, hoping to see the matter of Joffrey's trial resolved and Sansa safely prepared for travel. Sansa was thin, quiet, prone to nightmares. She had refused to speak of her treatment under Joffrey beyond a few tearful admissions. Robb seethed at the thought. In the end, it was decided that Roose Bolton and some of the more diplomatic northern lords would remain in King's Landing to witness the trials, while Robb would return home. If the realm demanded a formal presence, let them rely on men who had a stomach for such intrigue. Bolton, though unsettling, was skilled at reading men's hearts. So, on a clear morning, Robb Stark and his retinue prepared to ride north. The Great John, the Blackfish, and several thousand men-at-arms. They had Sansa with them, relieved to be leaving but frightened of what might lie ahead. She clutched her mother's arm often, as if fearful that any moment might bring new horrors. Before departing, Robb and Stannis met in the courtyard. A small crowd of onlookers gathered, eager to see this final moment between the two kings whose alliance had shattered the Lannisters. Stannis stood with a handful of his household knights, Davos at his side, the new Baratheon banner stirring in a faint breeze. Robb wore no crown this morning, only a simple cloak pinned by a wolf's head clasp. Grey wind waited near the horses, as though sensing his master's mood. Stannis inclined his head stiffly. "You've done your part. The realm, what is left of it, owes you a debt. I trust your independence in the north shall remain unchallenged." Robb nodded. "I'll protect my lands and my people, as is my duty. If you face new threats from those who remain loyal to the Lannisters, let us know. Our pact may remain intact, should you need the North swords again. Though my father warned of the cost of entangling alliances." His gaze flickered with memory. Stannis allowed the ghost of a grim smile. "Likewise, if the Ironborn or any other threat presses you, we may be able to assist, so long as the men of the North remain the allies they have proven to be." Catelyn Stark stepped forward. "You have my thanks, your grace, for seeing Sansa released." She bowed her head, though the gratitude was tempered by the memory of Ned's death. She would never forget the role Stannis had played in punishing those responsible, nor fully forgive the realm for the blood spilled. Davos nodded politely. "Safe travels, my lady. We will keep looking for Arya." With that, the final goodbyes were said. Robb and his men mounted their horses. The column clattered through the courtyard gates, and the direwolf standard receded up the King's Road. Stannis remained, arms folded, watching them depart in silence. In a few weeks, this city had been torn open and stitched back together in a grotesque tapestry of shifting powers. He turned and walked inside. The city needed him more than ever now. Trials, tax reforms, the forging of alliances that might hold the realm together. War had brought him here, but only governance would keep him on the throne. The trial of Joffrey Baratheon began less than a fortnight after Robb's departure. They held it in the throne room, where the Iron Throne loomed over all. Stannis presided, wearing the crown and dark robes emblazoned with the flaming heart. He sat not on the throne itself, but on a sturdy seat at the dais's side. The hand, Davos Seaworth, stood to his right, looking out of place in finery. Various lords ringed the dais. Ser Axel Florent was there, representing the Stormlands. Ser Gilbert Faring, Lord Valerion, and Lord Celtigar. On the far side, representing the North's ongoing interest, stood Roose Bolton, silent and pale, with a handful of lesser lords. Several Tully bannermen lingered as well, though the Blackfish had gone north with Robb. Joffrey was brought in, wrists bound, escorted by 4 gold cloaks. He looked a shadow of his former self. The arrogance remained in his features, but fear lurked behind his pale green eyes. The hush that fell over the hall was almost tangible. The public had been barred, lest they attempt to lynch him on the spot. A scattering of lords and knights watched from the perimeter. Stannis let the hall settle, then spoke in a voice that carried. "Joffrey Baratheon, known to the realm as King Joffrey, stand forth." Joffrey glared upward, refusing to kneel. His chained hands shook. "I am the king," he spat, voice cracking. Stannis did not so much as blink. "You are charged with high treason, with the murder of Lord Eddard Stark, with the unlawful imprisonment and mistreatment of Lady Sansa Stark, and with abetting the lies that placed you on the Iron Throne as a bastard born of incest. You stand accused under the laws of gods and men. How do you plead?" Joffrey's lips curled in contempt. "I plead that you are all traitors. This is my throne. I was crowned by rightful authority. You," he turned, hissing, "you're no better than the Starks or my drunken fool of a father. You stole my birthright." A stir of anger ran through the watchers, some placing hands on sword hilts. Stannis raised a hand to quiet them, face stern. "It would be better for you if you answer more wisely, boy. You have the right to defend yourself or name a champion." Joffrey shook, red blooming across his cheeks. "My champion is my grandfather Tywin, Warden of the West. He'll see you cut down." Lord Bolton spoke up, voice devoid of emotion. Your grandfather is fled, beaten in the field. He has no power to champion you here. Perhaps you had best speak for yourself. The day stretched long with testimony. Lords recounted how Eddard Stark had discovered Joffrey's parentage, how Joffrey had demanded the man's head despite pleas for mercy. Gold cloaks told of Sansa's humiliations, of Joffrey's random cruelties. Maesters produced records that confirmed the black-haired Baratheon traits had never appeared in the Boy King. The trail of incest between Cersei and Jaime Lannister was laid bare once more, the same evidence Ned Stark had gathered from a tome of lineages. Through it all, Joffrey stood stony-faced or shrieked defiance. Once or twice he attempted to strike a witness, only to be held back by the guards. By day's end, Stannis rose. We have heard ample evidence of your bastardy and your crimes. Do you have a final word in your defense? Joffrey's face twisted. He spat at Stannis' feet. You have no right. I'll see you all burn. The Lannisters will He never finished. Ser Roland's storm clout him in the mouth, silencing the outburst. A hush gripped the hall. Stannis exhaled. The court finds you guilty. The punishment for regicide and high treason is death. The sentence will be carried out at dawn tomorrow. Joffrey stared in disbelief, blood trickling from his split lip, eyes wide. You can't. He faltered. No one moved to defend him. The reality that no rescue would appear seemed to crash upon him. His bravado bled away, replaced by wild-eyed terror. Please, he sobbed, voice breaking again. Don't kill me. I was the king. I only did, please. But mercy was absent. The guards dragged him away. No one spoke. Stannis remained still, his face a carved granite mask, though a faint tremor worked in his jaw. For all the hatred he bore Joffrey's memory, sentencing a boy, no matter how cruel, to die was a grim duty. He consoled himself that justice demanded it. Perhaps the realm might find closure. Cersei's trial followed 2 days later, a smaller affair. She was charged as an accomplice in Eddard Stark's murder, for conspiracy to conceal the bastardy of Joffrey, and for myriad acts that undermined the lawful succession. Unlike Joffrey, she did not hurl curses in open court. She stood tall, stoic, though her eyes burned with hatred for every witness. She demanded trial by combat, certain that Ser Jaime Lannister, her champion, would come to her aid. But Jaime was still a hostage at Riverrun, and word was that he had not entirely recovered from his captivity. With Tywin's forces scattered, no one else was bold enough to champion her. In the end, her demand was refused on the grounds that she was complicit in the greatest treason of the land, and every available champion was either absent or uninterested in risking their neck for the disgraced queen. When the guilty verdict was pronounced, she showed no outward panic. She only stared at Stannis with pure loathing. I hope you choke on that twisted chair, she said in a low, shaking voice. Rot in the seven hells, Stannis. Rot forever. Her fate was not immediate death, for the council debated whether her knowledge might still be of use, or if she might be ransomed for Jaime or for the Lannister gold rumored hidden in Casterly Rock. In the end, Stannis, urged by Davos and some others, chose to imprison her indefinitely rather than publicly execute the Queen Regent. He might gain leverage with her captivity. She was led away without ceremony, stripped of her wealth and finery, caged in a separate tower. She did not scream or beg. The faint tremor in her eyes suggested she was verging on madness. Thus ended the Lannister presence at King's Landing, at least for the moment. Tyrion remained in custody, though less harshly kept. Stannis recognized that the dwarf had tried, in his own way, to preserve the city from Joffrey's worst impulses. The question of what to do with Tyrion lingered. For the time being, he was not put on trial, as there was no strong evidence he had conspired to murder Ned Stark. On the contrary, many testified that Tyrion had opposed the cruelty. So he remained in a kind of house arrest, ironically in the same tower once used to confine him by Catelyn Stark. When dawn broke and Joffrey was led to the courtyard for execution, the city gave a collective sigh. Some said it was justice. Others said it was monstrous to kill a boy, no matter his crimes. Regardless, the watchers were silent. They saw the once king dragged before the block. They saw the sword lifted. He shrieked for mercy, for mother, for anyone, his voice echoing off stone. Moments later, the sword fell. Blood stained the cobblestones. A hush settled, broken only by the cawing of carrion crows that nested along the battlements. The false king was no more. The effect on the city was immediate and profound. The Lannister stranglehold, symbolized by Joffrey, had been severed. Small folk who despised him quietly felt relief or even grim satisfaction. Some of the new gold cloaks privately admitted they would have killed him themselves if the chance arose. Yet the realm took note as well. The king in the north had undone the boy who killed his father, and the rightful king, Stannis, had administered the sentence. News traveled to every corner of Westeros. Joffrey was dead, Cersei imprisoned, the Starks ascendant in the north, and Stannis Baratheon crowned in King's Landing. It seemed that the War of the Five Kings was effectively over, though pockets of conflict remained. In the Reach, the Tyrells pressed for new trade agreements. In the Stormlands, some lords who had once wavered between Renly and Stannis now grudgingly accepted Stannis' rule. In the Westerlands, Tywin's ragged armies regrouped near Casterly Rock, uncertain whether to mount a last stand or sue for terms. Some rumored that Tywin had gold enough to raise new mercenaries, while others whispered that the Old Lion was a spent force, humiliated by the combined might of Stark and Baratheon. Farther north, the Ironborn raids escalated as Balon Greyjoy pressed his claim to the seas. The Watchers on the Wall warned again of wildlings uniting under some king beyond the wall. The realm had no shortage of strife. But for King's Landing, the immediate storm had passed. A hush lay over the city as though it had seen too much violence already. Stannis and his new small council settled into the daily grind of governance, collecting taxes, ordering repairs on the battered walls, building new alliances with lords who had been forced to pick a side. Loras Tyrell, who had arrived with Margaery some days ago but refused all parley, roamed the city in a black mood, avoiding Stannis and Melisandre. Lady Margaery continued her negotiations quietly, an expert in courtly dealings that Stannis found tiresome. She offered plausible solutions to the city's dire shortage of coin in exchange for seats on the council and other concessions to the Tyrells. Bit by bit, the tapestry of power was rewoven. Robb Stark and his men reached the neck in good time, the King's Road clearer than expected now that the region's fighting had moved west. As they neared Moat Cailin, Sansa found herself trembling at the sight of the looming ruin. This was the gateway to the north, the threshold of her home. She had dreamed of crossing it again, of seeing Winterfell's towers, but nightmares plagued her still. The memory of King's Landing, the sneers of Joffrey, the moment he forced her to look upon her father's head mounted on a spike. She pressed her eyes shut, trying to banish the image. Catelyn rode beside her, noticing her daughter's distress. She reached out, gently placed a hand on Sansa's gloved one. "It's all right, sweetling. Soon you'll be home in Winterfell. You'll see Bran and Rickon again, and the land you grew up in. We'll leave those horrors behind us." Sansa tried to smile. "Yes," she murmured. "Home." But in the back of her mind, she remembered the rumors that the Ironborn were attacking the coasts. She hoped Winterfell had remained untouched, that her younger brothers were safe. She had not seen them since the day she left for King's Landing with father and Arya so many moons ago. And Arya, somewhere out there, lost. Sansa felt a stab of guilt that she could not rest easy until her sister was found. Robb rode at the head of the column with the Great John at his side, both scanning the horizon. The men grew more at ease as they passed Moat Cailin, for they were among friendly territory now. Grimy from the road, they halted only briefly to rest the horses and water them, then continued north. A crisp wind carried the tang of marshland. Gray wind padded along, sometimes drifting into the brush in search of game, returning with fur matted from mud. For days later, the party reached the familiar site of the twins. There, they were required once more to treat with Walder Frey, who emerged from his fortress to greet the king in the north. The old man's cunning eyes darted to Sansa, to the men, to the banners. He offered them the crossing with ill-concealed smugness, reminding Robb that he had pledged to wed one of Frey's daughters in exchange for crossing. Robb, tense, assured him that the arrangement would be honored. The Freys gave them bread and salt and a frosty welcome, still uncertain if this new king would keep his vows. Catelyn eyed them warily, recalling her father's mistrust of Walder Frey's reliability. But no violence erupted. The crossing was obtained without incident. Word of the king in the north's return spread quickly up the road. When they at last reached Winterfell, the gates stood open in welcome. A hush descended upon the travelers as they entered the courtyard, for many men had not seen this place in months. Bran Stark waited there, perched on Hodder's broad shoulders, trembling with excitement. Rickon stood near him, trying to act brave, clutching Shaggy Dog's scruff. Mira and Jojen Reed were present too, though they hung back, watchful. Sansa, dismounting, felt her heart leap into her throat at the sight of Bran. She rushed forward, tears streaking her cheeks. He reached out from atop Hodder, hugging her awkwardly. She embraced him as though afraid he might vanish. Rickon hovered, uncertain, until she knelt and beckoned him close. They clung together, a family reunit. Robb embraced his brothers, relief etched on his face. "Is all well here?" he asked, scanning the courtyard. Guards in House Stark livery stood at attention, though some wore newly patched cloaks. Bran nodded. We heard about Balon Greyjoy's raids, but they haven't reached Winterfell. The Ironborn attacked the stony shore and seized Deepwood Motte, but we're safe. Lord Manderly's men were able to hold White Harbor. He paused, swallowing. We lost some men, but we're holding. I sent ravens asking for you. Robb exhaled heavily. I received them, but we were delayed by the war. Now, with Stannis on the throne, we can focus on the Ironborn. I'll not let Balon Greyjoy carve off parts of my kingdom. A small flurry of activity broke out as the castle staff came forward to greet the returning king. The Great John boomed greetings, already praising the mead and roasted boar he expected for supper. Maester Luwin, a tired but kindly man, approached with a wide smile, inquiring after Sansa's health. She nearly burst into tears again, overwhelmed by the warmth and familiarity. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she felt safe. That night, the lords and ladies of the North feasted in Winterfell's hall, remembering those they had lost and celebrating the homecoming of their new king. Sansa wore a plain gray gown, conscious that she had no southern finery left. She sat beside Catelyn, across from Bran. Rickon ate noisily, clearly thrilled that the hall was lively again. The Great John led a round of hearty drinking songs, the refrain echoing off stone walls. For a moment, it felt like a simpler time. But beneath the laughter and music, Robb and his chief bannermen spoke in subdued tones of the Ironborn threat. They mapped out how to reclaim Deepwood Motte and secure the coast, with an eye to preventing the Greyjoys from sailing deeper into the north. Between one course and the next, Sansa slipped away, stepping out into the Godwood. She needed the cool night air, away from the noise. The heart tree's pale bark glowed in the moonlight, the face carved in it seeming to watch her approach. She knelt by the pool's edge, looking at her reflection, a young woman, eyes ringed by weariness, but alive. She rested her hands on the grass. Here, the old gods of the north seemed close, the hush of the wind a soothing lullaby. She closed her eyes, silently thanking them for bringing her home, and prayed that Arya might find her way back as well. Far to the south, King Stannis wrestled daily with the burdens of the throne. The small council quarreled over finances, over the seat of Master of Laws, over how to handle Tywin's lingering forces in the Westerlands. The city demanded more food than the Tyrell shipments could manage. Marjorie Tyrell negotiated an arrangement that allowed her father to station Tyrell troops just outside the city, ensuring safe passage for their supplies. Some claimed it was a maneuver to keep a Tyrell army near King's Landing, but Stannis was in no position to refuse. His own men were stretched thin, many having returned to Storm's End or Dragonstone to see to their homes. As the weeks wore on, Tywin Lannister sent an envoy requesting terms. The old lion had no illusions left about retaking King's Landing, but he demanded that Cersei be released into his custody and that Lannister lands remain untouched by crown retribution. In exchange, he offered gold from Casterly Rock to help fill the ravaged royal treasury. Stannis saw it as a brazen attempt to buy back Lannister influence. The council debated for days. Davos suggested there might be wisdom in some arrangement, for more war would only further drain the realm. Melisandre privately counseled that the Lord of Light demanded Tywin's downfall, that a great darkness clung to House Lannister. The Tyrells, too, had their opinions. Mace Tyrell wanted to see House Lannister humbled, if not destroyed outright. In the end, Stannis delivered a blunt response. No release for Cersei, no full pardons for Lannister loyalists. But if Tywin would yield Jaime Lannister into crown custody and pay a substantial indemnity, the crown might be willing to let him remain Lord of Casterly Rock. The messenger departed in a state of nervous tension, uncertain if Tywin would respond with fresh war or acquiesce. Meanwhile, the Dornish sent cautious feelers. Prince Doran Martell, ever patient, observed the shifting allegiances from the vantage of Sunspear. He had no love for the Lannisters, who had escaped justice for the murder of Elia Martell during the sack of King's Landing decades ago. Now that the Lannisters had fallen from grace, Doran was content to watch them suffer. If Stannis stabilized the realm, perhaps House Martell might claim influence at court. If war ignited again, perhaps Dorne would stand apart. No one yet knew which path the prince would choose, and for the moment, Stannis had no desire to provoke the Dornish. In all of this, Tyrion Lannister spent his days in a comfortable tower, half prisoner, half uneasy guest. He was allowed parchment and ink visitors at set hours. He wrote letters to the Westerlands urging Tywin to make peace. He read tomes of city finances, scribbling notes on ways to fill the treasury. From time to time, Stannis or Davos would question him. Tyrion answered with a mocking wit that never fully deserted him, but beneath the bravado, he understood that his life hung by a thread. If Tywin tried to raise arms again, Tyrion might pay the price. One late evening, the door to Tyrion's tower chamber opened quietly. He glanced up from his wine cup, expecting a guard, only to see the Red Priestess enter. Melisandre's robes shimmered in the torchlight, her ruby pulsing faintly. Tyrion set the wine aside, swallowing. "My lady," he said, "I don't often receive calls from you. Come to show me the fire's secrets?" She studied him, no humor in her crimson eyes. "You are clever, imp, but your wit does not hide your fear." Tyrion forced a grin. "Fear? Certainly not. Merely caution. Anyone in my position would be cautious." She approached, the scent of smoke and myrrh clinging to her. "The Lord of Light's flames reveal many shadows. In yours, I see a man torn between family and conscience. I see you writing letters to your father, urging him to accept Stannis' rule. Yet you know Tywin Lannister's pride. Have you not realized it may doom you both?" Tyrion's mouth went dry. "I'm quite aware of my father's pride, thank you. My entire life, I've lived under its shadow." He folded his hands, trying not to look unnerved. "I do what I can." She studied him a moment longer. "A darkness gathers in the west. The old lion will not surrender easily. Blood calls to blood. But whether the darkness devours you or is devoured by you, I cannot see." Her lips curved in a faint, enigmatic smile. "You might have a part to play yet. Should the day come when you must choose between your father's legacy and a better realm, remember that the night is dark and full of terrors. Sometimes a single candle spares many from the darkness." Tyrion frowned at her cryptic words, but she turned and swept out of the room before he could formulate a response. He sat there in the hush, a chill working its way along his spine. He raised the wine cup once more, but it tasted bitter in his mouth. While King's Landing strained to rebuild, the north flared with conflict against the Ironborn. A series of swift raids along the coast forced Robb Stark to dispatch lords to secure their holdings. The Bolton men went to the Dreadfort, staying alert for any Ironborn incursion. The Great John marched west to muster an army that would retake Deepwood Motte. A handful of Manderley ships patrolled the Bight, hoping to intercept Ironborn raiders. The war did not have the scale of the southern campaigns, but it was savage in its own way, with small villages burned and farmland pillaged. Robb set his seat at Winterfell, establishing it as the capital of the new kingdom of the north. Lords and sworn swords arrived to pay homage. The nights grew longer, cold winds sweeping through the courtyard. The howling of dire wolves sometimes echoed in the forests. Despite the threat of the Ironborn, a sense of battered optimism pervaded Winterfell. The young king was home, and the new kingdom might endure if they could cast out Balon Greyjoy. Amid these pressing matters, Sansa Stark tried to reweave the threads of her life. She took comfort in the presence of her brothers, even if they were changed. Bran was no longer able to walk, his eyes distant as though he dreamed of greater mysteries. Rickon was wild and restless, having grown up too quickly in the face of war. Still, she often read to them in Winterfell's library, retelling the old stories of House Stark's heroes, or else walked with them through the Godwood. She had nightmares of Joffrey's leering face, but day by day, the North's quieter rhythms eased her. She wrote letters to the Eyrie, hoping her Aunt Lisa might have news of Arya, but no word came. Late one evening, she ventured alone to the top of the walls, gazing out over the snowy fields. A fresh dusting of snow had fallen, blanketing the battlements. She closed her eyes, imagining Arya out there, traveling incognito, or already safe somewhere. She prayed to the old gods to protect her sister, to bring her home. For so many nights, Sansa had prayed in King's Landing, but the Seven had done little to save her from torment. Here, in the north, she felt the old gods were more attentive, though they spoke only in silence. A faint crunch of snow alerted her. She turned to see Theon Greyjoy approaching. He wore a thick fur cloak, the squid sigil of House Greyjoy on his surcoat. A slight smirk curved his lips, the same cocky grin she remembered from her youth, when Theon had been a ward of Lord Stark. But there was wariness in his eyes now. "Sansa," he said quietly. "You're up late." She dipped her head, wary. "I couldn't sleep." She still wasn't sure what to make of Theon's presence here, especially with the Ironborn rebellion under his father. But Theon had sworn to stand with Robb. She'd heard stories that Balon disdained him for his years spent in Stark custody. Tense rumors suggested Theon might be torn between his father and his foster brother. He nodded, leaning on the parapet. "Aye. Me neither. Hard to rest when your father's men are burning villages along the coast. My father never did care for me. He'd as soon break me on the rack as accept me back." He sighed, breath misting in the cold air. "I suppose you blame me for my family's raids." Sansa shifted. I don't know what to think, Theon. You were raised alongside us, yet your father and sister wage war on the north." His jaw clenched. "I know. I can't change it. I made my choice when I stayed with Robb. Perhaps one day I'll face my father's wrath. She studied him in the moonlight, seeing the flicker of shame behind his bravado. They stood in awkward silence, the wind cutting across the battlements. At length he said, "I'm sorry, Sansa, for all you went through in King's Landing. I never wanted that. If I'd been there, I don't know what I could have done. Probably nothing. But I'm sorry all the same." She looked away, blinking back tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "I appreciate it." They fell quiet again, the hush of the winter night around them. Snow drifted down, dancing in the glow of distant torches. Theon cleared his throat. "I'll see you around. I have to leave for Torrhen's Square tomorrow to muster more men. Maybe soon we can push the Ironborn back into the sea." Sansa just nodded. He departed, footsteps crunching, leaving her alone. She wondered if his path would lead him into tragedy. So many lives were torn in this endless struggle for crowns and honor. She stayed on the walls a while longer, letting the cold numb her thoughts, then returned inside to the faint warmth of Winterfell's corridors. Weeks stretched into months. Stannis' rule in King's Landing solidified bit by bit, though the realm's burdens weighed heavily upon him. Messages from the west indicated that Tywin Lannister, cornered, had sacked a minor crown-aligned castle in frustration. But the old lion seemed reluctant to mount a full offensive with his diminished forces. Stannis responded by dispatching loyal Stormlander bannermen to the region, forging alliances with local lords who had long hated the Lannisters. The Tyrells sent a token force to harass Lannister supply lines, though how far that force might press was uncertain. Meanwhile, Stannis dealt with the gnawing problem of the crown's debt. The Iron Bank of Bravos had demanded repayment of large sums borrowed by the former regime. Tyrion, from his tower, offered a cunning plan involving new taxes on shipping, certain minted coin expansions, and restructured interest payments to the Bravosi. The small council argued over whether it was wise to trust a Lannister's advice, but Davos insisted the logic was sound. Stannis, loath to rely on Tyrion, grudgingly approved certain measures. The city sighed under increased taxes, but it was better than the despair of famine and war. Gradually, more ships arrived in port, merchants returning with the hope that stability might yield profit. Yet the nights remained uneasy for Stannis. He felt the weight of every murder, every betrayal. Sometimes he dreamed of Renly's face, twisted in betrayal, or Ned Stark's stoic visage. The presence of Melisandre comforted and unnerved him in equal measure. She claimed that the dawn of a new era was at hand, that only by serving the Lord of Light could Westeros stand against the coming darkness. But from the corners of his mind, Stannis could not banish the memory of that intangible shadow that had ended his brother's life. War was monstrous, yet he feared he had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. One evening, a messenger arrived from Eastwatch by the Sea, carrying a raven's letter marked with the seal of the Night's Watch. Stannis read it by lamplight in his solar, brow furrowing as the wind rattled the shutters. The letter spoke of greater numbers of wildlings gathering beyond the wall, of strange sightings in the haunted forest, of the old legends stirring. The new Lord Commander Jeor Mormont, or his successor if Mormont had perished, begged the realm to send men and supplies. Stannis tapped the parchment thoughtfully. War in the south had overshadowed the real threat in the north, but the watchers on the wall rarely cried wolf without reason. Melisandre entered unbidden. She seemed to sense his mood. "You have read of the darkness beyond the wall," she said softly. "I told you once that a great war is coming, one that dwarfs mortal squabbles. The true enemy is not the Lannisters or Greyjoys. It is the cold that does not yield, the night that does not end." Stannis set the letter aside. "So the Watch claims. Yet I have a realm to stabilize. Half the kingdoms are in chaos. And the north is now a separate kingdom, ruled by Robb Stark. It's his responsibility to guard the lands beyond the neck." A flicker of candlelight danced in the ruby at her throat. "He cannot do it alone. The living must unite or die. Do you not recall the ancient tales of the long night, of Azor Ahai reborn, who stands against the darkness?" He closed his eyes, weariness dragging at him. "I remember your prophecies, but I have heard so many claims and half-truths I hardly know what to believe. My duty is to the realm. That includes the north, whether or not it is politically separate.